I'm delighted to introduce our next expert, Professor Virginia Murrey, Public Health Consultant at Public Health England, who is Vice Chair of UNISDR's Scientific and Technical Advisory Group. So Virginia, why does disaster risk reduction and the Sendai Framework agenda matter to members of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association?
Do you know, this is a huge privilege to be with you, Katia, to talk about this, and I'm delighted you're doing this masterclass, because to me the Sendai Framework is the most incredible story of incredible, committed political negotiation, and I've had the privilege to sit through as an observer for much of this. I have been the United Nations International Strategy on Disaster Risk Reduction Vice Chair of their Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee for 9 years. And I sat the whole way through the development of and leading to the negotiations on the Sendai Framework. And I really want to have this opportunity to share it with my Commonwealth colleagues, who I know have been really actively engaged in this. So the Sendai Framework is something that has a vision. It's a vision about disaster risk reduction, because disasters really hurt governments. But most importantly, they're people. We need to save life, we need to save people's ability to live, we need to save the environment in which they live. We know that disasters, if you look at 2000 to 2012, cost trillions, have hurt billions, probably at least half our world's population, and have killed well over 1 million in those 12 years. But quite how we define this and how we understand these figures and how these figures can be used by parliamentarians is really difficult. So how has the change of the different types of events happened? Well, they've been very complicated. What we do know, if we look back over 30 years, we can see a significant increase in the numbers of floods and droughts. A lot of these storms, floods, droughts and other events are probably related to climate change, and that's coming through as a very strong message. But climate change is not something that parliamentarians can respond to easily, because it has a longer vision, a longer timeline. But disasters are here now, are here today, and shock governments, and indeed can result in downfalls of some governments. And the one thing we need in a disaster is the best leadership we can have. So why does 2015 really matter? Because we had the most incredible time. We had 3 UN landmark agreements that talked to each other, that were driven by the UN member states. They were all there because that's what the UN member states wanted. And of course the Commonwealth nations are at the heart of these member states. So the first one is the Sustainable Development Goals, but the timeline for the Sustainable Development Goals really just rose in 15 years from the Millennium Development Goals that happened in 2000. The Climate Change Agreement has taken a bit longer, but of course is even harder to negotiate and will take time. But the Sendai Framework has been evolving really since the 1980s. And it started initially with the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, huge leadership here from the Caribbean, from Barbara Carby and others who were much engaged. But then we moved to the Yokohama strategy that was agreed in 1994 in Japan. And then we set up this special secretariat underneath the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, followed by the Hyogo Framework in 2005, which was agreed within the month, of course, of the terrible earthquake and tsunami that happened on the 26th of December 2004, with many hundreds, even thousands of deaths. So this time the Sendai Framework was really driven because of the Japanese earthquake, tsunami and the Fukushima event. And the Japanese volunteered to host all the UN member states to come together finally after years of negotiations, some of which I sat through, some of which we were allowed to really contribute to, which brought together all these member states who sat behind their flags, who sat behind where they came from. And if they wanted to ask a question, they lifted their flag, they lifted their sign. And they talked, they shared, they discussed, they negotiated. Some words really caused problems like exposure, vulnerability, governance. But finally, these words were resolved. It was the most incredible experience to watch this and to be an observer through this from the scientific point of view. So it was agreed in March 2015 by those who were present, and then by the time we moved forward to the UN General Assembly in June, it was ratified and endorsed by the whole of the UN General Assembly. So every member state of the UN members have now adopted it. What does the Sendai Framework really mean? Well, it's really about let's have disasters, let's not have them. So it has a very clear global outcome. It has 13 guiding principles. It has 4 priorities for action, 7 global targets. I'll take you through the targets shortly. But the global outcome to me is visionary. Difficult to achieve, possibly impossible, but it talks about prevent new and reducing existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazard, exposure and vulnerability to disasters, increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. Isn't that a fantastic wish? So how are we doing it? There are 4 priorities for action. Understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, so spending some money to make sure we deliver better, but also enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. And I know my colleagues on this masterclass will be talking about this, but I'm concerned about obviously national and local levels, which is where our parliamentarians sit. But it doesn't work if we don't link to global and regional levels. Really critically, we should do that. So what does it address? Well, it actually addresses the strengthening of technological and scientific capacity to capitalise and consolidate existing knowledge and to develop and apply methodologies and models to assess disaster risk vulnerabilities and exposures to all hazards. That's quite an ask. So I use this cartogram, which you'll see, of all the different things that we would expect. Most people think it's just natural catastrophe. It's not. It's climatic catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, it's technological catastrophe. Of course, it's epidemic disease. What about humanitarian crises and migration? We've had huge problems with that. Political violence, very worrying. Geopolitical conflict. So much of the world is in conflict. There's even trade disputes when you can't access materials you need. And then, of course, financial shock, which means there's less money to invest in this. But the bit I really like about this proposal, this understanding of all hazards, is the question mark. What don't we know? So to me, I was extraordinarily privileged to be able to be the chair of the coordinating committee of the UN ISDR Science and Technology Conference we ran last year, and there's some really strong messages came out of it. We had a roadmap that was agreed, and in there was a call for support and stronger involvement of the use in science to inform policy and decision making within and across all sectors at all levels, but also develop expertise and personnel to use the statistics to develop policies for disaster risk reduction. Why? Because you have to access information. It's critical to successful disaster risk management, and you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And we need to measure. So people spend their money wisely, spend their political engagement appropriately. And I was delighted to tell you that on the 2nd of February this year, the UN General Assembly adopted a huge piece of work we'd been doing. We've agreed not only on these global targets, but also the 38 indicators that sit underneath them, and the terminology, the language, translated into the six major languages of the UN, so very accessible, not perfectly so, but very accessible, and hopefully fits with many of the Commonwealth needs. So, our big global targets, we've got them agreed. We need to reduce mortality. We need to reduce the number affected. We need to reduce the economic loss. We need to reduce damage to critical infrastructure, be it basic, healthcare or educational facilities. For me as a medical doctor, the healthcare is critical, but it's not just the facilities, but it's also making sure they function. And we need to increase countries' abilities to understand what risks they run. So understanding a national risk register, possibly following a national risk assessment, planning so you have the resources you need, and then linking to international cooperation, something that I know our Commonwealth partners do very well and very helpfully. And then there's that wonderful one that the European Commission brought in, availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information assessment to all people by 2030. Wouldn't that be amazing if we can deliver that? So we now have the indicators. I give you one, the global target A. It's about death. And actually counting deaths from disasters is much harder than you think. It's not just those who die at once. If you have a flood, it's not just those who drown. It could be those who get electrocuted, who suffer trauma because they get swept away. It could be those who get an infectious disease. It could be those who get so desperate that they commit suicide because they cannot resolve their issues. And that is why we're struggling so hard to make sure those indicators really reflect what each country needs and wants to do. But we're doing it in partnership. We're doing it to help every country to make sure they can deliver this, and that we can look at the other part of the indicators, which is about missing persons, which of course was a huge issue with the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, and in many others. So what we do now is every 2 years we have a global platform. We bring together, this time in Mexico, over 7,000 registrants, with many countries there, heads of state, but also all the communities at every level, be it local government, be it academics, business, meteorological organisations, whatever's going to help the most. And the great message at the end is the Chair's summary. And I'm just going to give you 2 quick points from the Chair's summary, which I hope will help our national and local governments. In it, though, is highlighted that resilience and sustainable investment depend on the ability to ensure integration and coherence across policy instruments and regulatory frameworks. Critical. We need to understand so that parliamentarians find it easier to do, and that we need to have this idea of building better, strengthening systems at national and local levels to help communities have policy frameworks and legal systems for reconstruction. There's a huge amount here. Each of these different statements take a lot of work. But let's also take the fact that we need to link the SDGs, the Paris Agenda, to the Sendai Framework. If we do this, we'll have one system of monitoring, which might make everybody's lives easier, but also much better to deliver what's needed for parliamentarians. There's a declaration of local and regional governments that was issued at the global platform. The link is in my talk. You can have a look at it. It's only 3 pages, but I think helpful. And the final message from the United Nations was that the UN Risk Reduction Forum in Cancun closes with a call to harness data. If we don't have the data, we cannot manage. So my conclusion is that the Sendai Framework, I know, is a voluntary framework, but the need for it is so clear, and parliamentarians are so critical to how we deliver this. And to have this opportunity to work with this masterclass is really exciting for me. To me, disaster risk reduction will extend to many different legal regimes. They could be soft, non-binding policy or hard, formal, binding law governing a broad range of disasters. But ultimately, delivery at national and local governments and communities in partnership with regional and international collaborations is key.